If I was a farmer, I would be so glad. I would tell it to my mom and I would tell it to my dad. Welcome back to devlog. In the last part, I worked on my magical game system, and in this part, I work on the interactions of fire elementals in my magical game system. Explaining this movement system is better explained in three parts. First of all, the movements, left or right or up or down, the jumping system, as in when you hit the ground you hop off the ground, and the visual effects for it. Firstly, going into the movement, what I do when interacting with a fire object is that I place speed away from the object. So what I do for this is I check whether the player has collided with an object that is fire. I will then have a line drawn from the player to the fire, and I will add a velocity amount to the player in the opposite direction, so basically moving away from the fire. This is a fixed amount just based on whatever the fire speed is, so if the fire speed is 12, we're adding 12 units of force away from the fire. This is only applied when the player touches the side of a fire object, so if the player lands on a fire object and stands on it, they won't have this effect applied because the fire is underneath them, and they will just hop around like normal without any left or right velocity added. Next, when moving, I have to log the player's movement so they are always moving. When typically moving, in my game, if you stop pressing an input, you stop moving. But with fire, that is completely different, because you continuously move because you're on fire, so I have to get this frantic effect of the player hopping around, being on fire, trying to put it out, and not being able to stand still. This is a very simple system, actually, to do. All I do is make it so that the value that reads the player as input amount is always set to 1. If it was 0, the player would not be pressing an input and then we would have 0 force acting on the player. I just override this when the player is on fire, so I'm giving an artificial input. And this same system is used for a lot of other movement systems that I have, where the player has to always be constantly moving. Basically, I just lie to the controller I made, and I say the player is still holding their inputs down and is currently moving. The only difficulty of this is if the player is not holding an input, we don't have an input direction. So in this system, I will just take whatever the player's last direction was if they are not pressing an input, and I will continuously try to move in that direction when the player is not pressing an input. Finally, all I have to do is adjust the movement values to work with this system. As always, I code my games in a substate system. So basically, I run the system for the player's movement in air, which is what they are doing. I will then have the values for irregular in-air movements, and then when the player is in their substate fire system, I will just alter these values. It's a very, very simple system to do. I highly recommend this sort of subsystem coding techniques when you are making your game. Basically, if the player is on fire, I lower control from a 12 to a 2. If the player is on fire, I will lower acceleration from a 3 to a 2, etc, etc for every movement value. This means that I can very simply make a new substate system, and all I have to do really is just alter these movement values to influence how the player interacts. Next, we have the fire's jumping. This is separated into 3 parts: the initial jump, the first few jumps, and the final jump. The first initial jump is the first initial height we have leaving the fire object. This is going to be the highest one. The player jump off the fire. Basically, they touch the fire, they jump very high. The usage of this is generally if you want to make the player move very quickly or jump over a larger gap in the game. An easy way to do this is to make an object turn into fire, and the player will be able to hop off it. Because there isn't any damage systems in my game, because it's not a game that needs damaging, it's a puzzle game, you can use fire to have this certain movement value. For example, maybe you turn some walls into fire and you hop left and right from them because the fire is burning you and pushing you upwards, so that's a solution to a puzzle maybe. The initial jump is the highest, then we will slowly make a section of shorter jumps. This is done very simply. When I have the player first initially touch the fire, I will set a value to indicate the number of jumps they have remaining until they stop being on fire. This is set to 10. When the player initially lands from their first jump, this is ticked down to 9, and then I calculate what their jump height should be by dividing the current jump from the jump's total, this being 10. So 9 divided by 10 would be 0.9, so the player will jump at a value of 0.9 less than their regular jump height. So if the regular jump height was 10, it would be 9. The only complexity to this is I add a weighted amount to the first 3 jumps after your initial jump, so these will be significantly higher than the preceding jumps, and then the preceding jumps will start to get a lot shorter. So you have your initial jump, which is the highest, your next 3 jumps, which are still pretty high, and then your proceeding further jumps, which are going to be shorter, as the player eventually lands on the ground. Then finally, for our final jump, if we have our jump values tick down to 0, we have no more fire jumps left, and we will stop jumping and just remain on the ground. The only complexity to this is if you touch fire once again, this value will be reset, return to 10, and you will continue to jump because the player has essentially reignited themselves. Finally, we had the visual effects of the being on fire. This is separated into, once again, multiple categories. There is the animation of the player on fire, there is the animation of the fire itself, there is the fire particle system, there is the fire trail, the fire impact, the fire audio, and the fire turning itself off once you have stopped being on fire in a very specific way. The first of these is the fire animation, which is mostly masked by the fire, so this is the reason why I only animated it for the player facing forward. This is a animation that is only visual and facing forward. In any other animation in the game, you have a variant for if you're facing left or right or backwards or diagonally. With the player being on fire, it's just a forward facing animation because I have already drawn a lot of frames of animation and I didn't feel like drawing them for being on fire. Realistically, the player is going to be moving rather chaotically when on fire in the first place. They are going to be changing their velocity direction a lot, and it's also a very chaotic animation with a lot of smear frames, so I thought anything other than one facing direction might look a bit odd. And also, it's obscured by a visual effect most of the time, so you can't really see it that much. And finally, I feel like it being the one facing direction of the player on fire actually looks pretty endearing because you can always see the player's very panicked little expression when she is on fire. If you're unfamiliar with smear frames, essentially I have animated this in a way where a lot of the motion is blurred in between the frames of animation to give the illusion of it moving very fast, because this is one of the animations that actually moves very fast in the game, in opposed to the other ones which last about 6 or 12 at most frames per second. This one is around 24, so it is moving a lot faster than the rest of the animations in game, and therefore I have to have this very big feeling of motion as the player is moving when they are on fire. Next I had the fire animation itself. This is a 6-frame animation of the fire swirling and then removing itself and going out. Essentially, I needed a effect for a toony fire effect, so I just drew one because it was much faster than trying to get a particle system to make a fire effect, so it was easier to draw a toon one. It fits with the aesthetic and art style of the game, being cartoony fire, and also looks cooler, I think, than a regular fire particle system. Maybe I'm just a snob, but I don't like how fire particle systems look in most Unity fire particle systems. I think this one looks nicer because it's toony and more fun. When the player sets on fire, I will then duplicate the fire elements that the player has attached to them as a visual component, and I will set this enabled to basically make the player set on fire. This has 3 different visuals for the fire. We have the actual fire that is on the player, a larger fire in the background of the player, and then a trail to have the player moving while they're on fire. I think the trail effect of the fire, it adds lots to the visual of it because you can actually see with the trail of fire that is left behind where the player is moving, and it gives a illusion of how much they are moving and how frantically they're moving because they're leaving all this fire behind them. When the player touches the fire or the ground as they are hopping, they will leave a small impact of fire, which I think also helps to sell this visual of the player very frantically being on fire, because they're giving this little burst of fire when they touch something to give a bit of an impact effect when they hop off the ground again. And this is also accompanied by a audio component of a psst, kind of like a hiss of the player hitting something very quickly and it hissing because the player has hit it with a very hot object. Finally, we had the player not being on fire anymore. This is very simple, the player turns off the fire, but what do we do with the visual effects? Well, one method you could do is just destroying the visual effect, but that would make the fire sharply turn off. My method for this is that when turning the fire off, I will find all particle systems associated with the fire object, this being the fire on the player, behind the player, and the trail behind them. I will then find their particle system component. I will then disable looping on all of these components. Regularly, the fire will continuously loop and it will continuously play. With looping disabled, once its duration has stopped, the fire will stop being on the player and it will stop creating more fire. I will then attach an object to the parent of all these fire objects, and this will destroy it once the actual particle systems have all stopped. The way I check this is I just make a delay period on this component that destroys it, which is the length of the longest particle lifetime in the system. So if the longest particle lasts for 1 second, I will make this delay 2 seconds just to allow for some easing before destroying the object. This means that I can smoothly disable particle objects without just destroying them and making the particles disappear. Finally, we have the more minute complexities of this system. My game has a lot of different systems involving in it, and these need to organically interact with each other. If the player hits an object that is made of water, they will stop being on fire, because the water put it out. Luckily, this is a very simple system to do. When the player naturally touches water, there's already a check to make sure that the player goes in water, so this check is still running if the player is on fire, so there's nothing really to disable here. All I have to do is make sure if the player is on fire and touches water, that all of their regular audio and visual components that are enabled when they're on fire are disabled when they touch the water. Another weird complexity is when the player touches an object made of goo, the player will bounce off the goo. However, if the player is on fire and they land on an object, they will also bounce off it organically because of their jumping fire. What do I do in this situation if the player is both jumping because of the fire and because of the goo? What I do is I check which jump would be higher. If jumping off the goo would be higher than your regular jump with the fire, because the jumps with the fire's heights are inconsistent, I will just default to the height being the jump from the goo. So the player, when touching something that is made of goo when on fire, they will always jump as high as they possibly could in either situation. And that is it for devlog. I am talking about the systems in this game in a out of order fashion. I'm generally just talking about whatever I'm currently making that I have the most interest to talk about, but I will eventually talk about every system that is in the game that I have missed out on. For example, moving objects. It's a very complicated system that I've added and also interacts with the elemental systems. That is the first thing I added and then never discussed about. There's actually a lot of complexity to this game system. It's a very complicated game. On account of it being a puzzle game, I feel like puzzle games probably have a lot of the higher complexities in game design because there's a lot of things to account for, especially an open-ended one like I am designing. I am also trying to add a bit more detail and complexity to the video editing and the visual components of my devlogs so that you have a better idea of what I am talking about and I'm not just rambling over generic gameplay footage. I'm trying to incorporate some visuals to really exemplify how I am making certain systems or what sort of coding I have used. If you find these sort of visual differences interesting, you should maybe leave a comment and tell me about it, because if you don't, I'll just stop doing it. I probably won't, because I enjoy the effort and detail of a project now. Additionally, I am also using the thumbnail videos as an excuse to further develop my artistic skills as a good little practice for just drawing the character doing funny things. I have a lot of fun drawing the thumbnails. I will probably be posting the full versions of these without the text on my Twitter eventually, because I find these artistic drawings of the main character very, very endearing. I have a little soft spot for colourful creatures with big noses. Anyway, devlog over, hugs and kisses, mwah, mwah, mwah.